Return of the Mount Hua Sect, Chapter 161. No, even though you had to do it, this is too much. Faster, faster! Sasuke, we cannot speed up anymore. What nonsense, can't you see that? Baekchun's voice was filled with urgency and anger. Although they were climbing at a frantic pace, they couldn't overcome the initial difference from those who began the climb first. At this rate, the Wudang disciples would reach the goal first. If that happened, Chongmyung would have to deal with Wudang's disciples all by himself. No matter how inhumane he might be, there was no way he could deal with so many Wudang disciples. Not just Chongmyung, even Chongmyung's grandfather couldn't handle them. No, Chongmyung's grandfather shouldn't be brought up. But would it be possible for Chongmyung if he became an old grandfather? Well, that doesn't matter now. If you don't want to see your Sajet die, use every bit of energy you have and move. Let's move! Huh? Baekchun climbed the cliff even faster than before, with Yu Yisol following closely behind him. Even though they followed the same training schedule every day, they were the second-class disciples, while Yunjong and Jogul were the third-class disciples. There was still an unmatched difference in their stamina. Gul, be strong! We need to move faster! I might die! Stop whining! Yunjong clenched his teeth. Falling behind Baekchun didn't hurt his pride. Baekchun was like an idol to him. Yunjong was angry at himself because Chongmyung might be in danger, yet he couldn't move any faster to help him. How can I... Huh? At that moment, Yunjong noticed something strange. Some of the Wudang disciples climbing the cliff turned around and started to crawl towards the disciples of Mount Hua. What are they doing? Do you think they're coming to stop us? So strange, right? Tell me about it. It was weird. All that training to fight on the cliff seemed useless. I didn't think it'd help out here. Yunjong drew his sword, and so did Jogul. Would they deal with Wudang disciples if they were on flat land? If they were sane, they would never dare. Firstly, Yunjong couldn't find anyone younger than him among the Wudang disciples. What's more, along with the third-class disciples, there had to be some first- and second-class disciples mixed in. But they were currently on a cliff. Yunjong and Jogul were two people who had been on the receiving end of Chongmyung's sword on a cliff. You're digging your own grave. Your grave! Yunjong crawled towards the Wudang disciples that were approaching him. Jogul, who watched the scene from behind, mumbled, It's so annoying. Petty tricks! Ho Sanja bit his lip as he watched the weapons embedded in the floor flying at him. But just because it's a petty trick, that didn't mean that it would be easy to deal with. Why were they called divine weapons? They were regarded as such because these weapons could cut through swords and slice through bodies strengthened with ki. If those weapons couldn't be dodged. At that moment, Ho Sanja's eyes widened. The divine weapons. There was not even a shred of energy on the flying swords. All that could be seen were rusted lumps of scrap metal. What? Kang kang kang. Ho Sanja raised his sword and defended himself. The swords that attempted to kill him were scattered away in all directions. Some were even cut in half because they couldn't withstand Ho Sanja's attack. What is... Among the rotten swords, there was one flying around with formidable power. Ho Sanja, frightened at the perfect weapon, flipped over. If something like this had come at him from the start, he would have dealt with it more calmly. However, he had been dealing with rotten swords until now, when a perfectly preserved divine weapon assaulted him unexpectedly. As a result, he panicked. And... swish! Chongmyung didn't miss the opportunity and rushed in to attack Ho Sanja from the side. Gah! Kang! Ho Sanja raised his sword to block the attack, but he couldn't keep his body from losing balance and bouncing back. Ho Sanja, who was thrown off the cliff, bit his lips. You're playing tricks till the very end. Ho Sanja used his sword to stop himself from falling and then lightened his body to climb the cliff once again. Chongmyung clicked his tongue at the sight. Seems to be lacking strength. It would be nice if the man just fell down the cliff, but it didn't seem like this would end that easily. Meanwhile, Hua Sanja standing on the cliff again looked at the swords sprawled across the ground. Right, they are swords. Looking at them clearly now, they were all rusted and dyed red. They looked to be in bad form. But if you think about it, this was bound to happen. They were known as divine swords, but they were all weapons made of iron. It was only natural for them to rot away if left alone for 200 years in this damp cave. However, among the many decayed swords, a few looked fine. In other words, these were not just divine swords in name, but truly divine swords. Right, but it's worthless anyway. Hua Sanja could feel the laughter of Yaksun echoing in his ears. The main purpose of those that entered the sword tomb was to obtain these weapons. Only a few, like the Wudang and Shaolin sect, knew that Yaksun and the untraceable seizing sword were one and the same. Even that was only known because of one of Yaksun's disciples had accidentally spilled the information. So, when making the sword tomb, Yaksun must have anticipated that those coming here would be pursuing these weapons. Did Yaksun not realize that these swords would rot? No way. If he really wanted to pass these swords on to future generations, he would have stored them in a better environment. They wouldn't have been put in a cavern full of moisture like this. Was he simply mocking those who would come here later? He surely wasn't a good man either. Hua Sanja looked at the wooden box. It didn't matter what happened with the weapons here. The true purpose of his journey was different. And it was probably the same for Chongmyung. Chongmyung also didn't pay much attention to the fallen weapons. It seems like we have the same purpose. If you want to take those swords, I'll be happy to send you off with them. You're quite naughty. You don't want to be too greedy. Actually, I'm quite greedy as well. Chongmyung pointed his sword forward. As time passed, Chongmyung would be the one at a disadvantage. The other Wudang elders would also arrive if he couldn't defeat Hua Sanja quickly. There's no other option. It was an inescapable truth that one fist could not match up against 10 fists. Even the heavenly demon was unable to escape this fate. Chongmyung had no intention of testing whether it was true or not himself. Here I come. You seem to be in a hurry. Well, you're just too talkative. Chongmyung's sword moved softly in the air. Hua Sanja's mood quickly changed. He realized that Chongmyung's sword was unusual. Red flowers began to bloom from the tip of Chongmyung's sword. Hua Sanja lightly exhaled and exclaimed in shock. Plum Blossom Sword Technique! You've really restored the Plum Blossom Sword Technique? My, and you looked so uninterested until just a moment ago. It seems like Wudang knew that Mount Hua had lost its techniques. Of course, what Chongmyung was currently displaying wasn't the Plum Blossom Sword Technique, but the Seven Sages Sword. However, it didn't look like that in Hua Sanja's eyes. Red petals began to flutter. In a place where nothing should be able to bloom, red plum blossoms were growing in a cave where nothing could live. The plum blossoms bloomed in unison and flew towards Hua Sanja. Hua Sanja lowered his sword. He lowered his stance. This was the most stable form where the sword of Wudang began. The sword began with a heavy move. Circle. Hua Sanja drew a large circle in front of him with his sword. The circle was the source. It was the origin form which everything began. In the beginning, there was just one world, but the world then divided into yin and yang, creating all things. After all, the world began with yin and yang, and that yin and yang was Taiji. Huh! The circle drawn by Hua Sanja's sword split and divided into two halves, one white and the other black. Both energies began to swirl and shift. Taiji Wisdom Sword. The greatest martial arts technique of Wudang and the technique that truly defined the Wudang. The Taiji Wisdom Sword was fully displayed in Hua Sanja's hands. Although Mujin had previously used this technique against Chongmyung, it was only a clumsy attempt that failed to capture the true essence. That failure didn't deserve to be called the Taiji Wisdom Sword. However, the technique that Hua Sanja was unfolding now was precise in every way. Chongmyung's flying petals became entangled with the dazzling Taiji wisdom sword, soft and strong. The two opposing properties melted away. The petals were gently sucked in and crushed. To be able to make plum blossoms bloom at this age. If diplomacy didn't work, then defeating the child was the only option left. Killing intent rose in Hua Sanja's eyes. It's too early to be surprised. Chongmyung's sword swung once again. Mutual restraint. As Chongmyung had felt in the past, the reason why Mount Hua couldn't defeat Wudang wasn't that their martial arts were weak. The softness of the Wudang was the opposite of Mount Hua's sharpness. Swift and fast swords always revealed their weak points to the soft sword. But that is all. Just what is mutual restraint? Fire is extinguished by water, but a big enough fire can burn away any water. Anything can be overcome with a stronger force. Here it comes! The internal key, crouching inside the dungeon, responded to the will of Chongmyung. Impeccable and clear energy, the purest key moved from his dungeon and circulated through his body before moving to the sword's tip. Bloom. Blossoms bloomed again. The plum blossoms seemed to form a small forest as they bloomed again and again. This was no longer the Seven Sages' sword, 24-movement plum blossom sword technique. In the past, the Jongnam sect tried to steal this technique, but they were unable to execute it. Plum blossoms bloomed, one after another, fluttering and propagating endlessly. For a moment, Hua Sanja was captivated by the sea of blossoms flying towards him. How is this sword? For the Wudang, the beginning of everything was the Taiji. Inducing Taiji in the sword was like placing the world in the sword. But the sword he saw now seemed to speak to him. The source of everything. The beginning of everything. It wasn't that. The world itself was like that. If the Taiji represented one path, then the dew on the tip of a leaf at dawn was also a path. All of that can be considered the path of life. Everything was nature. The plum blossoms were fluttering, but the logic of the world was contained within them. Huh? As the petals collided with the Taiji, a huge storm ravaged the surroundings. It was fortunate that no one had reached the top of the cliff yet. If anyone else had been present, they would have been shredded into bits by the collision of both sword techniques. Hua Sanja bounced back and grabbed his chest. It pierced my sword. His chest was stained with blood. There was not just one injury. His entire body seemed to have been sharply cut as blood spewed forth. What about him? Hua Sanja shook his head. He could see the figure of Chongmyung lying on the ground. Chongmyung struggled to get up. Apparently, he wasn't all great either. Damage? Was he damaged? No. Maybe he was pushed back lightly. Respect rose in Hua Sanja's heart. At this moment, Hua Sanja wasn't able to help but feel admiration for this child. At the same time, however, the sense of crisis rose. You have quite the dirty intentions. Chongmyung struggled to get up and spit on the floor, although it was more like blood than saliva. This should come to an end now. That's what I was hoping for. The two faced off and looked straight into the other's eyes. But there was something that both overlooked. This place had no sparring ground or training hall where they could battle and go all out. Nor was this a time that they could fight, just the two of them. Sahyung! The both of them took a deep breath and turned their heads. Hogong. Finally, Hua Sanja's Saje managed to come up the cliff. For a moment, Hua Sanja's eyes fluttered in emotion. Realizing what he had done, he screamed with nerves popping in his throat. Saje! That wooden box! Grab the wooden box! Hogong turned his head. His eyes clearly saw the wooden box placed on the rock in the center. Yes! Hogong quickly flew towards it without delay. At that moment, Chongmyung screamed. No! Chongmyung tried to throw himself at Hogong, but Hua Sanja quickly blocked the way. This is the end, you brat. No, that's not... Chongmyung's eyes clearly captured the sight of Hogong grabbing the wooden box. We're all ruined. Those assholes.